Tonight on First Tuesday, Ethiopia's forgotten thousands, refugees from starvation and civil war.
There's no point in fighting if the people are finished. This is the saddest time in my life.
And the revolution that is carried on in the face of famine. Good evening. I can't pretend that tonight's programme won't disturb you. I can say that if you've been even remotely concerned about the tragedy in Ethiopia, it's a programme that I think you'll want to see. As you know, it's now several months since the world woke up to the latest famine in that stricken country. Since then, not least as a result of the extraordinary generosity of millions of people in Britain and elsewhere in the world, relief has poured in to save countless thousands of lives. Unhappily, the story does not end there. Throughout Ethiopia, there are now some 9 million victims of famine, almost 1 in 4 of the population. Most of the victims live in the north, the focus of the main relief effort. Of these, 2 million live in the province of Tigray, where as well as famine, there's civil war. Although the government holds the main towns in Tigray, the rebels control the countryside. The First Tuesday team is now back from a 6-week journey by truck and on foot through the territory held by the rebels. Their film, The Unofficial Famine, is a record of what they found.
This is the unofficial face of the Ethiopian famine, one of the biggest mass migrations of the 20th century. It is an exodus of 250,000 refugees who have abandoned their homes out of hunger. They are nearing the end of a trek of up to 30 days and nights. Their destination, the swollen refugee camps of the Sudan. These are the Tigrayans, the forgotten thousands of the Ethiopian disaster. The Tigrayans are on their long march because they can no longer live off the land. They are drought victims who have seen none of the world's aid. That aid has been pouring into Ethiopia for 6 months now, but not into the heartlands of Tigray. These people live on the wrong side of a civil war. And when civil war and famine coincide, the world's aid system breaks down. All the world's major relief agencies make it a rule to operate only through recognized governments. The government in Ethiopia, the Derg, has lost control of Tigray. The Derg can't or won't distribute food in rebel-held areas, and 2 million drought-afflicted Tigrayans go empty-handed, victims of the politics of starvation. Theirs is an avoidable tragedy. The Tigrayan rebels have offered the Derg safe conduct to allow relief into the countryside. Distribution anywhere in Ethiopia is difficult, but the offer has been ignored. The village priest offers up a final prayer. Let them eat. May God grant them a safe journey. This is the starting point of the refugee trail. The last inhabitants of our Sege village in southern Tigray have accepted that their lands and homes are worthless, that to stay any longer is to die. They are registering for migration. For the last 2 years, nothing but straw has been produced on the local farms. Although, for 100 years before that, these fields provided a stable living for successive generations of the Gemedi family. Indeed, Kiros Gemedi considered himself rich. He had 50 head of cows and oxen, but they're dead now. His food has run out, and today his family leaves for the Sudan. All except Kiros's mother Asafak. At 55, she is too frail to make the journey.
Leaving my dear mother behind hurts me most, but we are all starving. There is no point in us all being destroyed. She carried us on her back as babies. She always fed and cared for us. She always put our welfare before her own.
Naturally, I'd prefer to be with my children. But what will we gain by starving together? I want him to go and save his life.
Now that I am going, no one can help my mother. Everyone is in the same situation. I wanted her to come, but it is impossible. She is too weak to walk. We both cry when we think of leaving.
I believe in God's mercy. I'll stay here and wait for his answer. It's up to him whether I live or die.
As the family sets off for Sudan, 250 miles away, Tigrayan manners will not allow so much as a handshake of farewell for Asafak. She will now wait alone for slow but certain death. By dusk, another village is empty. Famine is upon the land. As throughout Ethiopia, death comes all too frequently in Tigray. Lemlem Belai died today. She was 6. She weighed 21 pounds. Lemlem's mother saw another daughter die the day before. Her own mother died the day before that. For what such statistics are worth, it's estimated that 90,000 Tigrayans have died in the famine. The toll is rising. It's now 5,000 a week. There are so many funerals that the priest no longer attends. Each migration, each death, diminishes the organization that runs Tigray, the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
There is no point in fighting if the people are finished. This is the saddest time in my life. I have seen many desperate times, but none of them is as desperate as this one.
Why is it so desperate?
Because the people that I am fighting for are dying because of lack of food. They are hardworking, but because of lack of support, because of lack of scientific agricultural practice, these people are dying because of no fault of themselves. That's the toughest thing for a fighter to face.
The TPLF claims control of 85% of Tigray, but not the government-held towns and feeding stations. The rebels can approach close enough to government towns like Axum to watch the world's airlift daily landing grain, but they're powerless to intercede. The food stays in the towns, and for a Tigrayan to go to a government town is to risk conscription, disease, discrimination, but above all, resettlement. The Ethiopian Derg has begun a controversial program of resettling 1.5 million northern drought victims in southern Ethiopia. It's all supposed to be voluntary, but it has a convenient side effect for the Derg, the dispersal of vast numbers of rebellious Tigrayans. The West is dubious of the Derg's real motives. It won't allow its planes to be used for the resettlement program. Russian Antonovs do the flying instead. Still, thousands of Tigrayans do go to the feeding stations, but many return with complaints. The Goseza family went to Mekelle.
I asked them to help us. They said, you are fit, you can join the resettlement program. But if you refuse, there is nothing we can do for you. We will not give you any food. This is what they said. So I said, what about my little children? I begged them to give my children some food. The man wouldn't listen. He said, you must go where we tell you to go if you want to save your children, or else they will starve to death here. I will tell you what I saw. There was this man who had gone there just for food. Then he changed his mind about resettlement and decided not to go. So he jumped off the truck which was taking him away. The soldiers told him to stop. He managed to start running about a distance from here to that tree. 3 soldiers ran after him and they caught him. They put him back on the truck against his will and it left. That's when I decided to come back. I didn't want to be forced. They beat them, they force them, they get them by the shoulder and by the legs. That's why I decided to get away.
The civil war in Tigray has largely been overtaken by the famine, but there are exceptions. 9-year-old Kasey Bereket has just been orphaned. He was leaving Tigray for the Sudan when his parents were killed in a scatterbomb attack by Ethiopian MiG jets.
I was trying to build a shelter from the sun at the time. The planes came and flew over us twice and left. We tried to hide, but they came a third time. Everyone was trying to hide. Everyone was screaming. I took my children and my nieces and held them close to me and tried to reassure them. We were standing under a leafless tree. Then the plane started to drop the bombs. One hit us. My 2 nieces were thrown one way, and I was thrown the other way. The last thing I saw were the bodies of my 2 little nieces.
18 refugees were killed and 58 injured in the attack. The Derg denied it happened, but when the injured reached Sudan, French doctors confirmed that these were shrapnel wounds. The war between the Derg and the TPLF has lasted for 10 years. The TPLF is fighting for self-government within Ethiopia, not for independence. They've had little outside help and get by with captured weapons.
Our resources are mainly taken from the Derg. We are not buying ammunition. We are not buying guns. We are getting it from the Derg. We are capturing it from the Derg. The people can't eat guns.
The Russian-made weapons that cost no money to the TPLF are costing the Derg dearly. With civil war on 5 fronts, the Soviet-backed Derg maintains Black Africa's biggest army. The poorest of countries spends $250,000 a day on defense, an ever-growing hard currency debt to Moscow. Rebel opposition is spreading steadily in Ethiopia. The Derg responds by spending still more dollars on arms and by conscripting ever more peasants into its army, just as Haile Selassie had done in the past. 50,000 new conscripts have recently been added to the army. Most of these Ethiopian prisoners of war, captured by the TPLF, are poorly paid peasants with little taste for war. The TPLF policy is to give their prisoners a 3-month course of re-education and then let them go. The TPLF has the motivation of a volunteer force. Despite regular offensives, the Derg has failed to break its control of rural Tigray. Yet the guerrillas have scant prospect of final military victory. Hope of a political solution is also remote. There are no negotiations between the Derg and any of the rebel groups in Tigray, Eritrea, Wollo, Gondar and Oromo. The TPLF is trying to promote a united front of rebel movements, but so far no viable alternative government to the Derg has emerged. The conflict is deadlocked. The superpowers have hardly helped. First, Washington propped up Haile Selassie's feudal empire. Now, Moscow sustains the Derg. Modern weapons have come to a backward land. Successive governments have failed to unite their people. Money for the cause. In the relatively well-off towns, money is freely given, suggesting popular support for the fighters. Today, the Derg is the common enemy, but Tigrayans feel a much longer history of oppression under Ethiopian rule. The song is of a past rebellion. In Tigray, revolution and culture are closely bound together. Since the TPLF is the effective government in so much of Tigray, they see the war as one of defending what they hold, and see the Derg as the oppressors. But how can the continuation of any civil war be justified in the face of famine?
There is still poverty, there is still foreign interference in Ethiopian affairs. The wealth of the nation is being taken by the Russians and others. On the political side, there is absolutely no political freedom. On the national aspect, there is still national oppression. Our language is being suppressed, our culture is being suppressed. Our people are being considered as second-class citizens. For these very reasons, we are forced to take the path of protracted armed struggle.
The path of protracted armed struggle goes hand in hand with political and land reforms. In Tigray and in the rebel-held areas of neighboring Wollo, decisions are made by mass association. The idea is that democracy springs from the bottom and is not imposed from the top. In Abiadi, the biggest town held by the rebels, the People's Council has gathered to discuss the famine. Generally, the townspeople are not starving, and here they're debating whether to step up help for the growing number of refugees passing through their town, and the causes of the famine.
Nature has played its part in the famine, but the real reason is the oppressive system that has existed here for centuries. No one helped us when we suffered in the past. No one taught us new methods of agriculture, so the land we worked became impoverished. We worked and got nothing. All our efforts and sweat were for nothing.
Committees have already been formed to help the migrants on their journey. We must help these committees by showing hospitality and compassion. We must make our houses available for the migrants. We should clean up our rooms to receive them. We should give them water and be as helpful as we can.
2,000 refugees a day pass through this town. We can't feed them all. It's just not possible. We should only do what is practical. We should give them cooking pans and firewood to keep them warm. But that's all we can do.
At the end of the meeting, the motion is put, whether or not to give more help to the migrants. It's carried overwhelmingly. But dissent is permissible. The leader of the People's Council is Alganash. She is a remarkable example of how some women have transformed their lives under the Tigrayan revolution, which places a strong emphasis on women's emancipation.
Before the revolution, I was first the wife of a peasant. I was married young. I was only 8 years old. I stayed with my husband until I was 16. Then I was divorced and I became a housemaid. After that, I was a woman who sold suwa, the local beer, and I sold my body. I became a prostitute. All this happened before the revolution. The Derg abused people terribly, especially women. The soldiers beat us and raped us. I know this because I was there. I personally had this experience. But now I have become a human being. I'm no longer leading a degrading life. I have learned to read and write. I'm now independent. I have self-respect. I have even been elected to lead the People's Council.
Perhaps the most striking image of change in Tigray is in the fighting wing of the TPLF, where 30% of the guerrillas are women. They kill and are killed on equal terms with the men. But for most women, there is an unchanging pattern of childbirth and toil. Women may now divorce their husbands. They can vote and they can own land. But for most, the prevailing fate is still poverty. One resource that Tigray has in abundance is willing labor. The TPLF Youth Association has been mobilized to build a road by hand across the mountains to link the central highlands with the more fertile west of Tigray. So far, the only traffic is the stream of refugees who can no longer wait for food to reach them. The importance of the project is that a road can bring food from the west to the starving and heavily populated center. Drought and migration threatened the first real education system that Tigray has had. The TPLF took over with just 6 schools in their province. Now there are 60. Previously, the Tigrinya language had been banned in schools. Tigray's deeply felt sense of national oppression is rooted in such denials of identity. Now their children are being taught their own history in their own schools and in their own language. No one is helping from outside. Self-sufficiency is at the heart of the Tigrayan revolution. The rebels have also started their own health service, with a stress on hygiene, public education and prevention. Beneath this tree is the TPLF training school for barefoot doctors, about to be sent into the field to cope with the numerous diseases that accompany famine. Tigray has no regular Western medical teams. It has less than 1% of its needs in medicines and drugs. Just 6 qualified doctors for a population of nearly 5 million. Inside this hut is the TPLF Institute of Chemistry. Its main project typifies Tigray's optimism and its pathos. They're trying to develop Tigray's first bar of soap out of wood ash and sesame oil. The only soap available, and it's a rare find, is imported by merchants. It costs 20 pence a bar, hopelessly beyond the reach of the average peasant. Yet soap is a simple but effective way of combating illness, from dysentery to the blinding disease of trachoma. It's a potential lifesaver, but Tigray's prototype bar of soap is still far from mass production.
Many children are suffering with trachoma, and of course so many people are suffering of bacillary and amoebic dysentery. This is because of the uncleanness. So our people in this time, they demand soap. The price of soap is high. So if we are successful in our experiment, we will make in production this soap. About 100 years ago, the Americans, they were doing this. Of course, the quality is not good. So if we completed this process, of course, we will make it in production.
Time is not on Tigray's side in its attempts to build a society from scratch. It's now the 3rd consecutive year of drought, the most debilitating of the 4 droughts this century. The fear is that soil erosion is approaching the point of no return. 50 years ago, this landscape was covered in trees, but the peasants have cut them down out of necessity and ignorance. Trees retain moisture. Without them, the topsoil crumbles. The pressure to overfarm exhausts the soil still further. Even if Tigray had the wherewithal, it would take another 50 years to re-establish a forest here. Irrespective of drought, those who cling to their land live precariously, tied to backward farming methods by centuries of feudalism. To add to their troubles, a plague of army worms destroyed much of last year's meager harvest. The soil is now so damaged that even rain has become an enemy. When it rains, it pours, and the weakened topsoil is washed down the hillsides. It becomes tempting to conclude that Tigray's agriculture is a lost cause, that the soil is irretrievably barren, that there is no choice but to abandon the land. Yet, in the center of the worst drought area is a valley called Shawata that gives the lie to such a notion. The farmers of Shawata are gathering in a bumper harvest of record yield. Sorghum, the staple crop of Ethiopia, grows as it should to above head height. The secret is deceptively simple. No technology required, just labor. A network of terraces and irrigation ducts enables rainwater to be retained and efficiently used. Three downpours a year is enough. While the surrounding harvests have failed and all the farmers evacuated, the 40 acres of Shawata have produced enough food to keep its farming families on the land. It seems obvious that schemes like Shawata should be copied throughout Tigray, but it's not so easy. Migrating peasants have to be encouraged to stay on the land, to convert their farms to terraces, and they can't stay without food to tide them over. The food for such work should be a once and forever investment, but Tigray can't afford to pay for it. Still, Shawata stands as proof that famine is not the inevitable consequence of drought. Shawata also makes the case for giving development aid to African countries to help them towards self-sufficiency in food. But in recent years, Western aid to Ethiopia, let alone Tigray, has concentrated on emergency relief. Virtually nothing has been earmarked for development. Nothing changed after the Ethiopian famine of the 70s to prevent the famine of the 80s. Nothing is happening now that will prevent the famine of the 90s returning to haunt the West. When development aid fails, the call for humanitarian aid soon follows.
People are dying every day. We are getting so little help from the outside. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans are at a point of starvation. What we can do, because we have nothing food for them. I know the suffering will get worse. We heard from radio that Ethiopia is getting a lot of aid from outside. I know that our people won't get anything unless they send it through Sudan.
The little-known backdoor route through Sudan is the one outside channel of aid. It's run by REST, the Relief Society of Tigray. But it's a trickle, 1,000 tons a month, compared with 100,000 tons a month that goes through the Ethiopian government. REST is supported by a few independent charities. Most of them are reluctant to admit it, for fear of jeopardizing projects elsewhere in Ethiopia. But it's the powerful and official bodies who really determine where food goes. The EEC, the British and American governments, the World Food Programme, the big American charities, above all, the United Nations. The REST convoy sees none of their money. If it did, refugee Tigrayans might not be forced to cross the Sudanese border to reach the world's relief. The convoy carries less than 5% of Tigray's most basic needs in food. It crosses Eritrea by night to guard against ambush or aerial attack. But there is not yet a road across the mountains into central Tigray or to Wallo, where the famine is at its worst. Here, the local people share out the last of their grain. No one knows where the next meal is coming from. The Derg has assured the outside world that it can bring relief to all Ethiopians. But in 6 weeks of traveling in the rebel-held areas of Eritrea, Tigray and Wallo, we saw none of the world's aid sent through the Ethiopian government. The one exception was on the black market. Common market butter oil, marked for free distribution, now on sale. 70 cans out of a batch of 200 that came originally from the government town of Mekelle.
I bought this from my friends, the soldiers at Mekelle. I pay 8 birr each and sell them for 12. There is no problem at all. It is the soldiers who are supposed to be guarding them who are selling. I am not doing anything wrong. I'm a merchant. I need my profit.
February and March will be the harshest months yet in the Ethiopian famine. The temperatures are rising. It's 5 months since the harvest failed. The Gesh, Tigray's second biggest river, has been dry for 3 months now. The refugees have to dig deeper every day to find water. As they approach the Sudan, the refugees face an uncertain future. Sudan is already host to 1 million African refugees. There is disease in its camps. Another famine is looming. Unless there is a fundamental change in the politics of famine, the refugees have little prospect of returning to their homeland, to their empty villages and their boarded-up homes, of ever seeing again their abandoned relatives.
I decided to die in my home. I tried to make the journey, but I was too weak. After 2 nights alone in the wilderness, I had to come home. 4 of my children died. Another tried to get food from the farm, but there was not a single grain. He went to the Sudan. This little orphan boy is with me. His mother died. There is nothing for him to eat, let alone for me. Death? No. I'm not frightened to die. Why should I be? There's nothing to live for when there's no food, when so many have died. No, I'm not afraid to die.
The unofficial famine, a tragic, complex and a contentious predicament. Because of that, we asked the Ethiopian government to join our discussion in the studio. They refused. We also asked the United Nations to take part. They too were unwilling, which shows perhaps how sensitive this issue has become. However, George Galloway, the General Secretary of War on Want, is here. War on Want works exclusively in the rebel-held territory. And also Malcolm Harper, the Director of the United Nations Association of the United Kingdom, who's been all over Ethiopia many times. Malcolm Harper, can I ask you first, on the basis of the evidence of that film, it seems pretty clear that, for whatever reason, the food is not getting into Tigray. Now, the rebels say that is because the Ethiopian government is deliberately trying to starve them out. Do you share that view? Do you feel that to be the case?
I think almost inevitably in a civil war, neither side is going to give any help to the cause of the other. And I think it is clear that the Ethiopian government is not doing all that it could to try and get food in, I would think for fairly obvious reasons. I think, having said that, there is a general problem in terms of food distribution in Ethiopia. We saw on the film, in the case of Tigray, that there are virtually no roads. That is not unique to Tigray. And it really does mean that for people to get government food in any part of the country, they have to come down onto the roads into the great relief centres, which in itself creates enormous problems.
If we stick with Tigray and the fact that food isn't getting in there, there is a route in through the Sudan. Now, I know you're not an official of the United Nations, but you are a part of the supporters club, if you like, of the United Nations. What is to stop the United Nations saying, we can see this terrible exodus of people, we will now send food by whatever means into Tigray? They're the only people who've got the kind of scale of resources that are needed.
Well, I think there are ways in which the United Nations should be taking urgent action to get food into Tigray. I think it's fair to say that they have been trying to get the Derg to agree that relief convoys should go into Tigray and into Eritrea under the UN flag, and the Derg, I understand, has refused to allow that.
So what stops them just going in there and saying, we're going to take the food in? They need the food, we're the international organisation that can do it.
From within Ethiopia, you mean, or from outside?
From the Sudan, because the Sudan's the only safe route, on the face of it, it's the only safe route in.
I think there are difficulties for the United Nations taking food to people who are in rebellion against the government of a member state. And I don't think we can underestimate the really practical and political difficulties for the United Nations if they do that directly and in open defiance of the government of that member state.
What are the difficulties?
Well, the difficulties are that at the worst extreme, the government of Ethiopia could say to the United Nations, will you kindly terminate all your work in Ethiopia? You are no longer an acceptable channel of aid for Ethiopia as a whole. And that means that many, many more millions of people would become adversely affected.
George Galloway, I know War on Want has been extremely critical, not only of the Ethiopian government, but also of the United Nations. Do you accept the kind of constraint that Malcolm Harper has been talking about?
Well, there are difficulties, but if the United Nations was not set up to tackle difficult problems, I don't know what role it has to play in the world today. And when we're faced with a famine of this magnitude that we've seen here this evening, described by the UN themselves as the worst catastrophe in human history, then to stand on some notion of sovereignty, that the Ethiopian government has the right to veto food coming in to relieve starvation of millions of people, I think is a scandal. And we've tried to bring that to people's attention. And it's not only the United Nations that are paralyzed by this notion, it's other governments and even some aid agencies.
You touched on the possibility that something could be done. I mean, do you talk to the UN, the people you know, and say, look, our supporters, I mean, as people in this country seeing you doing nothing are very frustrated. Do you put to them suggestions? What kind of suggestions?
Well, I think you have to say, see you doing nothing in a particular area of the country which is outside the control of the government. I mean, I think if you're beginning to imply that the UN is doing nothing in Ethiopia as a whole, then I must challenge that all the way down the line.
Now, I think it's recognized that Ethiopia is a very large area. There is a very huge famine, and in large parts of the country, the relief operation is going, by most assessments, very well. We're talking about the particular difficulty of these particular people.
Right. What I would like to see is the United Nations, through the High Commission for Refugees, through other organs of the UN in Sudan, trying to get donor governments, and don't forget the UN has to get donor governments to give the supplies and the finance that are needed, to put extra supplies into Sudan, knowing that a fair quantity of those supplies will somehow be got into, in this case, Tigray. But there are difficulties.
George Galloway, if the UN decided that it would put huge quantities of food down on the Sudan border and turn a blind eye to the rebels taking it into Tigray, could the rebels handle that aid?
They could handle the food aid, but what we also need is the transport to carry it. I mean, War on Want and other agencies in Britain are providing trucks, but it's pitifully inadequate. We need the wheels to move the food as well, and it won't be able to be done as covertly as Malcolm would like it to be.
In brief, would you like the UN to do that, to take that food to the border and let it be taken in?
I would be very happy to see some such operation being mounted, and being mounted very urgently. I mean, I think we have something of a precedent in the Kampuchea border program of the last few years. I was in Kampuchea itself when that was happening, and there were enormous political problems for the UN doing it. But in a situation like this, yes, I would welcome such a program being undertaken urgently by the UN, by the EEC, by whoever can get food and the wherewithal to deliver the food into Tigray itself.
Let's hope that happens. Thank you very much, George Galloway, Malcolm Harper. I'd just like to add a very brief personal note of my own, simply to reiterate that despite all we've heard, the problems tonight, the suffering in Tigray, aid given to Ethiopia so far as a whole has not been in vain. It has saved untold thousands of lives, and if it continues, it will, I'm sure, save many thousands more throughout that vast and tragic land, Ethiopia. Good night.
No,